if it's true or not, no one likes to be called racist. We also don't like it when someone we love, respect, or publicly support is called a racist. We feel attacked and wounded, which then leads to a variety of possible responses of our own. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines racism as a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. So that means anytime someone believes something about someone else, and that belief is based on that person's nationality, skin color, or anything else that one might use to identify race, that belief is one of racism. And anytime one person believes one race is holier, more worthy, or better than another race, that belief is one of racism. Those that live into the definition of racism don't have to be people who use racial slurs or display racist symbols. Racial slurs and symbols are just a way in which some people choose to express their beliefs of inequality and superiority. The thing about racism is that humanity is not born with it. It's something we're taught. So if it's something we are taught, it's something we can relearn, grow past, and be healed from. In the second part of today's gospel, we hear a story about a confrontation between two races, a Canaanite and an Israelite. The Canaanite and the Israelites have a long history, a long, violent, and bloody past. The writer of the Gospel of Matthew wants us to remember this history, and I know this because the writer labels the woman as a Canaanite. We don't personally think much about the name Canaanite. We see it all throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, the land of Canaan, the promised land of milk and honey. The thing is, for Matthew's listeners, is that the name Canaanite had not been used for centuries. In Jesus' time, Gentiles from this area were known as Syrophoenicians, and in this same story in the Gospel of Mark, the writer labels today's Canaanite woman as Syrophoenician. The time frame comparison of these two labels would be if we were telling a modern day story about someone who lived in Great Britain and we called them Anglo-Saxons. That's the spread of history when it comes to these labels. Matthew wants us to learn something from the power of his choice of words. The Canaanites were not only idol worshippers, they were labeled as enemies of God and enemies of God's people. When Matthew uses the label Canaanite, he wants us to remember the stories of how the Israelites invaded the land of Canaan, killing the people, and it's even recorded in the book of Judges that when Israel became strong, they pressed the Canaanites into forced labor. The writer of Matthew wants us to remember the past so we can learn, grow, and be healed through the power of this encounter. This story, when we hear it, is always shocking to our system, and if it's not shocking, it should be. It's just not the Jesus that I know. A woman calls out for help, and Jesus ignores her. He ignores her. She calls out so much that Jesus' disciples become uncomfortable and ask him to send her away. When Jesus does finally acknowledge and answer her, He says he was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. What she would have heard was that he was only sent to help her enemies, those who took her ancestral lands and pressed them into forced labor. This woman begged for mercy and called Jesus Lord, Son of David. She showed him that she was not lost. She knew who he was and that she needed his help to save the life of her child. Jesus replied, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." Because of her race, Jesus not only says to her that she is not worthy, he calls her a dog. There is no honest way around it. Jesus just revealed his racism through the use of the nasty racial slur of calling this woman a dog. Throughout Jesus' whole life, he would have been taught that Hebrew people were the chosen people, and they were to remain pure and righteous. His racism was learned. Do we hold this against Jesus? Or do we recognize that he did his best until he learned something new, and once he learned something new, he started doing better? Because today, Jesus learned something new, and he expanded God's box to include those he had been taught to exclude. What I love is that this Canaanite Syrophoenician woman forgave Jesus before she ever approached him. She forgave Israel for their past atrocities. At least she forgave them enough that she was able to see Jesus for who he was and publicly confess it. She also was able to respond to his racial slur in a way that opened his heart to a greater truth. Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. She is saying that the abundance of the master's table, the abundance of God, is so great that no one is unworthy of it. And even a crumb from that table restores life. Jesus had just said to the crowd, "Listen and understand. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but it is what comes out of the mouth that defiles. What comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this is what defiles." We want Jesus to be perfect, but what had just come out of Jesus' mouth was sinful. It defiled and degraded another human being. But the good news is that the story did not end there. This woman healed the heart of Jesus. And once it was healed, once Jesus was changed, his only response could be that of love. And he healed her daughter. The writer of Matthew wants us to listen in such a way that we learn and become healed. It is through listening and wrestling with the Gospels that allows us to listen and wrestle with what is on our own hearts and open our ears to notice what comes out of our own mouths. And if what comes out of our mouths is not worthy of the gospel, may we humbly accept even the smallest of crumbs and become the vessel of God's grace. Amen.